Alrighty, so the Maine. Let me just get us started. We're the Maine Climate Table, not to be confused with the Maine Climate Council. That's the governor's effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Maine. And then I know many of you, and I am too, involved in the Maine Climate Council, but this is not that. We're really glad to have you all here today. I'm surprised at how many people were interested in this topic. I don't know whether the topic is interesting or we all just need a break from the coronavirus news. But anyway, for the next hour, we're not going to talk about coronavirus. And Ellen Griswold, my co-presenter, and I are going to talk about natural climate solutions. And I'll introduce Ellen in just a minute. A couple of housekeeping things. I can turn mute on. I can mute everybody from my vast control panel here. But if you could remember to keep your phone or computer muted, that would help us. If you want to say something, unmute, jump in, and then mute again. Otherwise, we'll get some background noise. I would say you might want to turn off your video just to help with the bandwidth. If you've got good bandwidth, it may not be a problem. In where I am in rural Maine, sometimes I lose connection. Hopefully not in the next hour. I suggest you hold your questions to the end. Ellen and I are going to move as quickly as we can through the material. If you've got a question, write it down. If we say something or use a term that you don't know, jump in and say, could you please explain that? And we'd be happy to. And I will be recording this for people who wanted to be here today, but couldn't. Just wanted to let everybody know it's being recorded. Just quickly, what is the Maine Climate Table? Hopefully this slide will advance. It says we have a very big table because that's what it's going to take. Take a seat. The Maine Climate Table was formed in 2013, about 7 years ago, by Kathy Lee and several others who wanted to keep the climate conversation going in Maine during the previous administration. And we're still here today and very happy that the Maine Climate Council has been formed by the governor. But the table's goal is just very simple, twofold: help people be better informed about climate change, and number two, get more people engaged, especially those not engaged right now. Our view is that Democrats will never be able to solve climate change alone. So the Maine Climate Table is working really hard to cross these political and cultural and economic barriers that have divided us on climate change. So go to your website. Our website, maineclimatetable.org. You can learn more about what we do. I'm not going to go into that now. I will say one thing, that we're hosting a statewide climate summit in September, coronavirus permitting, which will really give the stage to the business community in Maine and let them tell us what they're doing to reduce emissions and really manage for climate risk. So mark off September 16th if you're interested, and sign up at our website if you'd like to get on our mailing list and not miss any of that. So now let me introduce Ellen. We'll be tag teaming through this presentation today. Ellen Griswold with the Maine Farmland Trust. Ellen, would you just introduce yourself? Say hello to everybody.
Sure, thank you. So as John said, my name is Ellen Stern Griswold. I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust. And John, do you mind just going to the next slide? Mm-hmm. So for anyone who's not familiar with Maine Farmland Trust, we are a member-powered statewide organization that works to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming. And since 1999, we've helped to permanently protect nearly 300 farms and keep about 60,000 acres of farmland in farming while supporting over 800 farm families with a wide range of economic support services. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So again, Ellen and I will be going back and forth. I'll talk forest, she'll talk agriculture. Those are our different expertise. We've got a lot of great people on the call today. Some probably don't know much about natural climate solutions, and some are scientists and know more than I know about natural climate solutions. Ellen and I have tried to put together a presentation that sort of hits the sweet spot. And we want everybody to be able to get something out of this. So apologies if it seems a little too simple, and we're trying not to make it too complicated for anybody. So bear with us. And as I said, unmute yourself if we use a term that you don't understand, and we'll try to explain it. Otherwise, hold thoughts till the end, questions, comments, whatever. So let's start with this term, natural climate solutions. As near as I can tell, the term was coined in the 2017 paper by Griswold and about 1,000 other authors. You can see the cover page of the article there. Nat, let me just read. 21 conservation, restoration, and/or improved land management actions that increase carbon storage and/or avoid greenhouse gas emissions across global forests, wetlands, grasslands, and agriculture lands. So 2017, I mean, we knew about these different land management actions, but it got this name in 2017 as a result of this paper. The 2017 was a global in scope paper. Then for Fargione, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right at all, published the 2018 paper that was just the same concept, but just for the United States. So we're kind of springboarding off of these two articles for the presentation today, sort of in the context of Maine. So what the big deal about these, again, the idea that we could manage forests or agriculture to be climate friendly was not a new concept, but what the Griswold paper did was put it all in one place and do the math that told us just how much of a potential there was for natural climate solutions to fight climate change. So here it says, globally, there's a potential to sequester an additional 11.9 gigatons of CO2e. I'll come back in a minute, or about 25% of our total global fossil fuel emissions right now could be accommodated by additional natural climate solutions. That's a lot. So that, they said, this is worth thinking about more seriously. Now, CO2e is a term that's often used to measure a ton of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, or an equivalent of some other gas that has the same effect as a ton of CO2. So we'll use this term CO2e throughout the conversation today. Okay, now the authors of both papers, and the authors overlap, really broke it down, as I said, into three kinds of categories of natural climate solutions. One is forest and forestry solutions. Trees sequester a lot of carbon and store it for free. So that's an obvious category. Agriculture is a big category of solutions as well. Agriculture is both an emitter and it can be both a source of emissions, and it can be a sink. We'll talk about that. And then we're not going to talk much about wetlands today, because that's not my area of expertise, and I don't think Ellen's either, but wetlands have a lot of potential too for natural climate solutions. I'll show a little bit of data on that, but we won't talk too much about it. Okay, I always like to sort of give the big picture. You know, why are we even talking about natural climate solutions? And I know much of it is obvious to most everyone on the call, but maybe there'll be some statistics here that help you frame it up as well. So probably the most complicated graph I've got to get through here in my part is this one. And let's just start with the axes, the timeline on the bottom, years on the bottom, and the emissions in gigatons of CO2e on the y-axis. We're at 2020 right now, and if we want to keep the Earth at no more than 2 degrees C of warming, I'm not sure you can see my arrow as I point on the screen. Ellen, are you there? Can you unmute and tell me if you're seeing my?
Yep, I am. We are.
Okay, that's great. That helps me. So we're at 2020. We've got to reduce emissions to along this below 2°C line over the next 80 years if we want to keep it, the warming, to no more than 2°C. Right now, we're on the brown line trajectory. We're going up, not down. We've got to start bending this down fast. We've got to reduce CO2. We've got to reduce other greenhouse gases along these curves presented in this graph. The green wedge at the bottom is the good news from natural climate solutions. If we can kick in these natural climate solutions, they will help get us to our goal a lot faster than just having to reduce fossil fuel emissions. We need to do all we can to reduce fossil fuel emissions, but the faster we can kick in these natural climate solutions, the faster we can get to net zero emissions and stay on this 2°C trajectory. Now, I said we're not doing so good right now because we're still on the upswing in terms of emissions. And it seems like every year we say we got to stop increasing and start decreasing our annual emissions. And per capita in the US, we are reducing our emissions per capita, but globally we're still increasing. We've got to bend that total global curve down. So far, we haven't done that. Natural climate solutions can help. Okay, we can only, for those of you, it's good to know this math. And it's just math and physics. It's not politics. The math, we can only add about 450 gigatons more of CO2 into the atmosphere if we want to stay below 2°C. It's just molecules vibrate. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. It's just math. So we're emitting, right, globally, we're emitting about 45 or so gigatons a year. Well, you can do the math. 450 divided by 45 is about 10 years. And that's why every year we get the beads of sweat start cropping out on our foreheads, because the math is not working out in our favor. So we've got to start bending that down. Okay, how are we doing in Maine? This is pulled out of the Maine folks put out a nice 2-page summary of carbon emissions in Maine. The link's at the bottom. You should go to it. I'll post the slide deck after we're done. But we peaked in the early 2000s in Maine, and it's been ratcheting down, so good for Maine. A lot of the reason, this is not my area of expertise, but a lot of the reason is the green area. We've switched from oil-fired electricity to natural gas. So that's pulling it down. One thing you'll notice in Maine, you probably heard already, is the orange part at the bottom, transportation. We're heavy to transportation emissions because we're such a rural state. And we need those electric F-150s, like yesterday. To help us with that part of our emissions. We're not sure how we're going to fix that, but the Climate Council is working on it. So let me switch back to, oh, no, not quite back to Ellen yet. The second most complicated graph is this one from the Fargione paper. Let me walk you through this. We're not going to get into the minute details here, but down the left-hand side of the graph are the 21 different natural climate solutions in those 3 categories. Then across that top axis is what they call climate mitigation potential. They use teragrams of CO2e per year. But so just for orientation, you can see, I hope if you can read that, reforestation is that big wide bar at the top with 300 potential teragrams of CO2e per year that we could save if we instituted reforestation practices on a more aggressive scale. Again, this isn't for Maine, this is for the US. So 300 teragrams is about 0.3 gigatons, just to put it back on, I said 45 gigatons globally. So 0.3 doesn't sound like all that much, 0.3 gigatons, but it counts. And again, this is only the US. So this is how they framed it up. All these different solutions that they calculated. One more thing, and this is important too. the dark green part, let's just look at the reforestation bar. The dark green part at the top right is the gigatons, teragrams in this case, that we could save if we paid $100, if we were willing to pay $100 a ton for carbon. If we're only willing to pay $50 a ton, we can only get 250 teragrams out of that strategy. And if we're not willing to pay but $10, we hardly get anything out of the reforestation. So part of this model or this framework of thinking is contingent on how much we're willing to pay as a society to get these things enacted. And that's critical because some things are more expensive than others to do, and it matters. So we'll come back to that later with forestry especially. Okay, now this is the big concept. Let me bring it down to Maine's level. Ellen's going to tell us what's going on with Maine and a project that she and UMaine and Wolf's Neck are doing with agriculture and forestry. So Ellen, I hope you're still with me, and I hope everybody's still with me. Okay, Ellen, you've got the floor.
Great. Well, thanks so much. So as John was just saying, there have been some really positive research findings about the potential of natural climate solutions as a climate strategy. But as he was explaining, a lot of those research findings have been specific to global or national studies, and even some of the more regional studies with respect to agricultural natural climate solutions are really based in the Midwest and the West. And so because they're based on other regions of the world or the country, in the agricultural context, they're based on assumptions or practices that are really more appropriate for other agricultural contexts and not necessarily the agricultural system that we have in Maine. And so we realized that we needed research specific to the potential benefits of agricultural natural climate solutions, the associated costs of those, and any sort of adoption barriers that were really tied to practices that made the most sense for agriculture in Maine. Because that's the only way that we would really sort of make informed recommendations about the types of practices that farmers in Maine should be using and really inform appropriate policymaking as well. So as a result, Maine Farmland Trust is now coordinating the Maine Climate Table's Natural Climate Solutions Initiative in collaboration with the University of Maine, Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment, American Farmland Trust, and some other partners. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well as the sort of timeline for those recommendations. So John, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide.
Okay. Did that work?
It did not. Oh, yes, there we are.
There may be a little delay. Yep.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so these are the four main components of this research project that we're undertaking with the partners that I just mentioned, and which is being conducted at the University of Maine. So the first is, with any study, we're first going to look at what is our baseline. Oh, if you could go back one, John.
There?
It looks like it's on the timeline still. Oh, wait, yep, there is great.
See, there's a delay. Sorry. Tell me
no
problem. What's the title of the slide you'd like?
This one is great. The Maine's Natural Climate Solutions Initiative Project.
Got it. I won't touch anything. Okay.
No problem. So we're first going to do an assessment of the current practices that farmers in Maine are using to see how many of them are already using practices, which I'll talk about in a minute, that fall under the category of agricultural and natural climate solutions. Then through a series of modeling, we're going to determine what are the most cost-effective natural climate solutions for Maine farmers. So we're going to look at all the potential benefits of those types of practices, and then we're going to also look at the costs associated with them and figure out what are the most cost-effective practices. And when I do want to mention, though, when we're talking about benefits or potential benefits, we're looking at a variety of benefits. We are looking at climate change mitigation or carbon sequestration potential, but we're also looking at what practices can really achieve some resilience or adaptation benefits for farmers, because we know that climate change is going to result in changing growing and weather conditions for farmers across Maine. We're also thinking about what practices are going to achieve potential benefits in terms of changes to water quality and quantity, because we know that we're going to see more erratic patterns of rainfall or heavy precipitation events, followed by periods of drought. And then we're also looking at what are the potential benefits in terms of farmer profitability. And we normally measure that in terms of increases in yield and reductions in production costs for farmers. So once we determine what the most cost-effective agricultural and natural climate solutions are for Maine farmers, we need to also understand what are the key barriers that are, might prevent farmers from adopting natural climate solutions, because it's great to figure out what the priority practices are, but if farmers can't use those practices in Maine, then it's really not going to help us achieve any of those climate benefits or co-benefits. And then we also want to figure out, generate some information about what practices can be implemented on a broader scale, because to really have an impact on climate change and the resilience of our agricultural sector in Maine, we need, a great variety of farmers utilizing those priority practices. And so really understanding which can be applied at scale is going to be really important. And so, John, you can advance to the next slide now, if you will.
Yep. Did that work?
Not yet, but.
Yep.
Oh, there we go.
Stand by. Yep. Blueberries.
Yep. Yeah, perfect. So this slide just basically provides a timeline for the research that the University of Maine is conducting. The only thing that I would note is that some preliminary results from the research will be available in the beginning of April. And that's because the University of Maine really does want to make this research useful to the Maine Climate Council process, and specifically to the Natural and Working Lands Working Group that I'm a part of, which is charged with creating some recommendations to update the state's climate action plan around natural climate solutions. And so I'll talk about that process and how we are informing that process a little bit further, but I did want to let folks know that some preliminary results will be available in the near term. And then, John, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide.
All right.
Great, thank you.
Good.
Yeah. And so just to give some folks a sense of some of the types of practices that are being evaluated for their potential benefits, we're looking at reduced and no-till farming. We're looking at cover cropping. We're looking at different manure management processes, biochar amendments, farmland conservation, and I'll talk a little bit later about why farmland protection actually is a natural climate solution, riparian management, and agroforestry. And so, these are just some of the practices that have been shown to have benefits in those national or regional studies, and we sort of want to see how they will play out in Maine's agricultural context. And John, I think it's going back to you now.
Okay. Do we have trees on the screen now, Ellen?
We do.
Okay,
yep.
Great. All right, my favorite subject. So let me talk a little bit about forests and forestry. There's a bunch of people are spending a lot of money to figure out how to build a machine to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it is kind of funny for those of you on the phone that are in forestry. Trees already do that. they do it really well. We're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That if the slide change, that's about a cubic meter of carbon dioxide. They're represented by wood. On average, a tree and a mature tree in Maine might hold anywhere from 2 to, if it's a really big old tall tree, 10 tons of CO2 equivalents. That's a lot of carbon when you think about all the trees in Maine, and they're just growing. They're just taking carbon out of the atmosphere for free. Now back to this Fargione forestry part of the graph I showed earlier. They listed 6 different, 6 different ways that forests might be used for natural climate solutions. And again, for my forestry friends on the call, you can jump in the discussion section. You may have some more things to say about these. My take on these, I'm going to say here, is that there's not a lot of opportunity for reforestation. We're 89% forested or thereabouts as a state. There's not a lot of places we can go put forests back that aren't. And if we tried, Ellen wouldn't like it because it would be planting them in farmland. And that wouldn't be a good idea. So, and we're mostly forested. Not a lot of reforestation potential here. Remember, this is for the US, not just Maine. Natural, let me go through these others. I'm going to come back to natural forest. We don't have a lot of opportunity for avoided forest conversion of forest to some other land use. There is some development in Maine, and I don't remember the statistic for conversion to development. But you know, it's not trivial, but it's not a lot either compared to our 19 million acres of forest land. Urban forest restoration, probably some potential, but not a whole lot in Maine. I wouldn't discourage any community towns from thinking hard about urban forestry, but again, relative to our forestry land base, not so much. Fire management, we're kind of a wet state anyway. Not that we don't have fires, but we don't have fires like California, and we don't have the fuel problem, forest fuel problem like they do out west. So that only leaves a couple here for Maine to think about. Natural forest management and improved plantation management, and I think they left one out that I would call timber stand improvement. But one is just the simple one, I guess you might call it natural forest management, extending the rotation length of the forest that we have, letting the trees get older and soak in more carbon dioxide during their lifetime before we make something out of them, like this wonderful yellow birch tree here that I suspect will go to veneer. So extending rotation length is one way to get more carbon out of the atmosphere. Plantation forestry is another way. This is 32-year-old spruce plantation on Irving land, and that's a lot of wood and a lot of carbon in just 32 years, and this is going to dimensional lumber, so it'll stay sequestered. That's good. We've got a problem in Maine with beech bark disease, so another solution is getting rid of that beech as fast as we can. To get they're diseased trees, they're not good for much, maybe biomass, I don't know, maybe pulpwood if they're not too bad off. But this whole notion of intervention, I mean, foresters know all this stuff, but doing things early in a stand's growth to accelerate the growth, it costs money. You have to invest up front, but you can accelerate the growth of the forest and the production of enduring wood products. So timber stand improvement is a big opportunity that I didn't see on the graph in the Fargione paper. And then, of course, we all know we make things out of wood, and the more we can build things out of wood, the better, because that carbon in the wood in this structure stays sequestered for 50 or 100 or more years. So the more we can build things out of wood, the better. The trees pull it out of the atmosphere, we make something out of it, and we keep it out of the atmosphere. So that's all good. The only problem is we only need so much construction material. So the real idea, the best idea here, is to start making things out of wood that aren't made out of wood right now. That's really how we get an additional gain. from using our forests for a natural climate solution. Now, switching to a topic I don't think Ellen and I either know too much about, but I did look up a little bit of data. Blue carbon, the third piece of the paper, there is salt marshes sequester a lot of carbon. So here's a little graph that shows how much salt marshes sequester per year carbon compared to temperate forests. And that's a logarithmic scale on the y-axis. So it's over 10 times as much per acre for salt marshes than forests. So that's good. Let's not forget about our marshes in Maine. But also let's keep it in perspective. I had to look this up. There's about 19,000 and so acres of salt marsh in Maine, and there's 19 million and change acres of forest. So we just got 1,000 times as much forest as we have salt marsh. So there's a lot to work with in the forestry sector. But I don't want to forget about the salt marshes, and we don't manage them like forests. It's more a matter of we're losing salt marshes, and we need to stop losing salt marshes so that they can go back to sequestering carbon. Okay, so we're going to change topics here a little bit. Sort of the last leg of our discussion or presentation before we get into discussion is ways to incentivize these natural climate solutions in Maine. Ellen's going to talk about some of the agricultural ways. I'm going to talk about a few of the forestry ways. So Ellen, I'm going to hand the podium back to you and move over to this next slide. And I hope it's queued up properly.
That looks great. Thanks so much. Yeah, so as I was talking about before, we're working, or the University of Maine is doing this analysis now to determine, what are the agricultural practices that have the most potential climate benefits and co-benefits and sort of are most favorable in terms of a cost benefit analysis. But then there's the question of how, once we've identified the priority practices, how do we encourage and support in the agricultural context farmers using those practices? And so I mentioned that the work of the research will help to inform the Maine Climate Council's Natural and Working Lands Working Group that I'm a part of. And one of the things that we are doing as a working group, I'm helping, with the agricultural climate change recommendations, which we need to, all of the recommendations of all working groups have to be provided to the Maine Climate Council by their June 17th meeting to inform then their analysis across working groups of what recommendations they are going to adopt for updating the state's climate action plan, and then present in December their report to the Maine legislature. But one of the ways that we have been trying to figure out what are the best ways to support farmers in adopting these practices is by investigating policies and programs that exist in other states that help to support farmers in adopting these practices, as well as sort of make some necessary sort of food system changes to address climate change and agriculture. So I'm just going to go through some of the categories that we've really been looking at, because I think these are the categories with a lot of potential. So the first one is just sort of the establishment of a healthy soil program. Several states have done this. You sort of establish the program within a state agency, usually the Department of Agriculture, and you create sort of a central hub of information related to agricultural natural climate solutions. So resources and grant funding available to support farmers using those practices, information about what those practices are and how they can be used, research, information related to who are service providers who could be helping farmers use those practices, and even profiling farmers who are using these types of practices with a high degree of success to really facilitate that farmer to farmer education and connection that's really going to be crucial if we want to expand these types of practices across the state. And so several states have, California, Maryland, New Mexico, and Nebraska is in the process of establishing a healthy soils program. And so that's something that we are thinking about here in Maine as well. Some states have started to undertake soil health assessments to determine both the degree to which farmers are already using many of these practices within their state, as well as what the potential benefits are. But we are, as I sort of described before, in Maine, we're sort of already doing that work, or the University of Maine is already doing that work. And so we're sort of a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of that. One of the most crucial components is thinking through what are the financial incentives that we can provide to farmers and related entities to really achieve widespread usage of these practices. Different states provide financial incentives in different ways, and so we're thinking about which sort of mechanism makes the most sense here in Maine. But some states provide competitive grant programs, and that's often to help farmers or provide farmers with funding to help offset some of the startup costs associated with switching agricultural practices, because depending on the agricultural operation, this could be a wide departure from what the types of practices that they have been using, and may require different equipment, different seeds, etc. And so just providing some funding to allow them to take on these new practices, particularly because there is a level of risk involved. Many of these practices don't start to accrue financial benefits for 3 to 5 years, and so during that interim period, it's helpful to provide some financial support to farmers until sort of the yields that they start achieving and the reductions in production costs sort of help to support them financially in and of themselves. Some states, particularly some in the Midwest and Southeast, are providing practice-specific incentives. So instead of just providing a grant to a farmer to utilize whatever practices makes the most sense for his or her operation, these are sort of tied to specific practices. So Maryland has a cost share program associated with farmers who want to use cover crops. And so other states are really trying to target one specific natural climate solution practice in order to achieve widespread usage of that particular practice. Other states are looking at crop insurance discounts, particularly in the Midwest, where there's high utilization of federal crop insurance programs, and this is normally done through a state-federal partnership so that you get a discount on your crop insurance if you are using, let's say, cover crops, for instance. So that's another mechanism or incentive for encouraging adoption of these practices. And then a couple of states, namely Maryland and Vermont, are investigating whether they can set up a sort of payment structure that would compensate farmers for the ecosystem services that they're providing, which are sort of all of the co-benefits, by utilizing these types of practices. And so it's not just providing financial support to farmers to offset some of the startup costs, but actually paying farmers for the continued usage of those practices. I will note that both Vermont and Maryland are just still in the working stages of that, and so we don't really have a full example. There are some voluntary carbon markets for the agricultural system, but we don't have any sort of statewide models yet for what that could look like. And then, increased support for farmer outreach, education, and technical assistance. This can come in many forms: trainings, workshops, on-the-ground consultations by service providers like Cooperative Extension. We know that as farmers use these practices, a lot of, it's going to be a lot of troubleshooting issues that arise. And so it's really important to provide farmers with the support they need. And we also know that in order to get the word out about these practices, it's going to require a lot of organizations like Maine Farmland Trust and other service providers really hosting and putting together the right outreach and educational materials to reach farmers. We also know that it's going to be really important to support expanded research and demonstration projects related to natural climate solutions, because although we've had these positive research findings and we're doing, this initial research in Maine, we're really going to need sort of long-term empirical studies related to the different natural climate solutions models that can be ground truthed on farms, just so we get a better sense of how these practices are actually playing out on the ground and what benefits are actually accruing. And then farmland protection. John, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide just for a moment, and then I might go back again.
Oh, hang on. Yep. Yep.
Perfect. So many states are starting to put, as part of their climate strategy, are starting to support farmland protection efforts. And so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about why farmland protection is a climate strategy, because that's not sort of immediately obvious, I think, for a lot of folks. And basically, farmland protection is considered a natural climate solution because studies have been done that show that the emissions associated with an acre of farmland are far fewer than the emissions associated with an acre of developed land. And so by keeping the land in farmland, you're avoiding those future emissions that would be associated with its development. You're also preserving the potential climate benefits that can come about with some of the management practices of that land that we've been talking about, like reduced tillage and cover cropping, etc. So several states have been providing increases in funding either for conservation easements to permanently protect the land or to support planning processes related to farmland protection efforts. And Maryland, California, and New York are examples of 3 states that are really putting a lot of resources behind farmland protection as a climate strategy. And then John, if you wouldn't mind going back to the last slide just for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so finally, I just wanted to say that another category that we're really investigating is the development of the local and regional food economy to achieve food security. And that's because we know that climate change is going to result in supply chain disruptions. And for a state like Maine, where 90% of our food is imported, that could pose some significant threats to our food supply. And so we need to make sure that we are including provisions in our climate action plan that really help to develop and support the development of our local and regional food economy, so that we make sure that as a state and as a region, we are food secure in the face of climate change. And I will just note, though, that when we're talking about food security, it's always really important to also be thinking about food access, because we're not, in fact, a food secure state or a food secure region if not everyone has access to that local or regionally grown product. And so, John, I think it's over to you now.
Okay, let's talk a little bit, a few more minutes about forestry. And unlike agriculture, the carbon offset market is pretty well developed and sophisticated. For forestry in particular, it's been in the works for 20 years or so. Essentially, this is paying landowners per ton of carbon, additional ton of carbon that they can grow or keep on the land. In Maine right now, there's 371,000 acres of timberland in a forest carbon in the forest carbon offset market, for a total of, as it says, about 6.5 million tons of carbon. So the market is up, and this carbon market is partly the California system. California has a cap and trade system. They will take forest offsets anywhere. And some of Maine landowners have entered into that system. There's also a voluntary carbon market out there that, say, a large corporation might want to offset its emissions, and they may have a forest project to do that. But the bar for a carbon offset project is pretty high. For example, if you're a forest landowner, you need to guarantee that this carbon is going to stay sequestered for 100 years. And if you're a landowner, you might not be ready to lock that up for 100 years. So there's, it's a high bar, it's a challenge, and then that's why not more acres in Maine are in an offset project now. But a lot are looking into it, and a lot have said we're not ready to do that yet. But at least it's an instrument. It's a financial market-based instrument that is up and running right now. Now in Maine, we've got other incentives like the tree growth tax law that gives a tax break for any landowner that has their timberland, small woodlot, large woodlot, under a forest management plan by a professional forester. You get a significant tax break. So that encourages people to keep a financial incentive to keep your land in forestry. My friend Cy Balch, I don't know if Cy's on the call now or not. I got this really long list of names, but he told me just last week about a new legislation in Washington state that I'm trying to look up and understand more about. But sure enough, there's a bill that's been through the House and the Senate. It's sitting on the governor's desk. He's preoccupied right now. But an act relating to recognizing the contribution of the state's forest product sector as a part of the state's climate response. And as near as I can tell, it actually pays landowners on a per ton of carbon basis. So that's new and different. And I'm trying to find someone I can talk to there that might be willing to give a webinar for us at a future date. So stand by for more on that. Now I think I've got Eric. If Eric Wahlberg's on the call, I wanted him to say a few words. Unmute yourself, Eric. Eric's with Manomet. He's got one of the Doris Duke grants, national scale Doris Duke grants for natural climate solutions. He's working with timberland owners across the U.S. Some of them are in Maine. Some of you may be on this call here. But Eric, I thought you could say just a few words about how your timberland owner friends are thinking about this climate issue. Are they engaging, afraid, trepidation? What do you got for us?
Sure, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, it's loud and
okay.
clear.
Good, good. Well, let me give you just a very quick overview of the project, just so you have some idea of what it's about, and then I'll address John's question on attitude. So our project is intended to identify and implement measures to increase carbon sequestration and storage on commercial forest land. As John mentioned, we've got 7 of the major timber companies in North America on board as partners. And we're going to be looking at 2 different pathways. Pathway 1 involves identification of measures that can be implemented through introduction to new technologies or modifications to planning and operations. And in this category, we're going to focus on measures that are cost effective and do not require carbon market support. Pathway 2 is going to focus on practices that are feasible only with carbon market support. And to that end, we're going to be looking at existing carbon market protocols, reviewing them and making some recommendations on modifications that will improve feasibility of market participation by our project partners. So very quick overview. And then to John's question on sort of attitude, there's a tremendous amount of interest in this topic in the industry. There are a number of different sort of external forces that are driving this. There's a lot of interest on the part of investors in how these companies are dealing with climate challenges, a lot of interest in the customer base. So, all that and sort of the recent impacts of climate have become more evident. So that's really kind of stirring the pot as well. So kind of in in synopsis here, we've got tremendous interest. I think that's what drove the project partners from getting on board with the project. And I think the real key question here, and this really lines up with what Ellen was talking about in the agricultural work, this is all about coming up with a set of solutions that fits within the constraints of running a for-profit business. And so that's really the difficult problem to be solved here. And I think that the extent to which we're successful in addressing that question, we've got a lot of enthusiasm to push this forward within the industry. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So that's let me just, oops, that's one, let me, hopefully that says questions and discussion, and let me just, we're done with the presentation part. Anybody like to add anything? You can ask a question, make a comment. I see a lot of names on the list here that are in the forest sector. Any thoughts, contributions you'd like to make?
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Unmute yourself and jump right in. Yes.
This is more for Ellen. This is Glenn Kaler from Maine.
Hey, Glenn.
Hi. So I'm working on that AGS report for the Natural and Working Lands group. So this is a bit of a closed loop because the report goes to Natural and Working Lands. But I think that report's going to have a lot of viability even beyond Natural Working Lands and the Climate Council. So I'd like to have a phone call with Ellen at some point to get some of her points into the report for other people to use. If that's okay.
Absolutely. I would, yeah, that sounds great.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
Good.
you.
Hey, John, this is Carbo from Landvest.
Hey, Carbo. Yep.
I think one of the key points that really ran through your whole presentation is this idea of ecosystem services and how we really need to look at, and as a forester, I'll focus on the forest side of this, that the whole idea of just keeping forests as forests should be job one because of all the benefits. And I think when we start doing these value equations with regards to climate change, there needs to be a broader understanding of the values of forests as ecosystems from the standpoint of clean water, clean air, habitat, all the related factors, and then coming up with a way to value it, because timberland investment is a pretty marginal business, and we're constantly under more threats and more exposure to risk. And I think that to look at those economic drivers that Eric mentioned, you know, from a standpoint of for-profit companies, we're all interested in this. We all want to do our part, and we're all trying to figure out how to make it work financially.
Yeah, good point, Carbo. And by the way, I skipped over the part about those two papers. They did actually acknowledge the co-benefits of these different carbon strategies and were very clear that there were multiple benefits. It may be in the end, you know, maybe it's hard to pay for a gallon of clean water, which you guys who are landowners are producing a lot of clean water for free. Thank you very much. It may be that, I don't know if we'll ever get to paying for clean water. Maybe we will from forest sector, but you know, if we can pay for carbon and that carbon captures other values, it makes it worthwhile for you to keep the forest, then we'll just pay for carbon. I mean, the question is, how much is society willing to pay for a ton of carbon? And that to me is the unreconciled issue here. You know, the more we're willing to pay, the more you can do in terms of producing ecosystem services. So anybody else got a thought about that? Any of our landowner friends?
This is Leah from Wolfsnack. I'm sort of thinking about it from the other side of that. Like, instead of looking at it for what we would value clean water as, is looking at the externalities of the negative impacts for not adopting some of these practices. So I was sort of thinking about it in the terms of Ellen's cost and benefit analysis, and if that is going to be a policy tool or a farmer tool in either case, trying to account for those externalities and how much that would cost as well.
That's a good point. In general, as you know, our economic system doesn't do very well with accommodating externalities right now. Every now and then we do. If a regulation is passed to limit pollution of some sort or another, that's essentially trying to cap or put a price on, if you will, these externalities. But yes, and I don't know, anybody know much about pricing these externalities? I mean, it's essentially paying to keep the ecosystem services that we've got, and there just aren't really good demonstrations of that right now.
It's hey John, it's Marty from E2 Tech. I can't get my camera to start for some reason, but I do a fair amount of life cycle analysis work, and ecosystem services are not priced, but as you probably know, I mean, they are always modeled, use of soils, waters, so forth. I'm working on one right now for a hardwood product from South America, and we're modeling we're looking for data on all of the ecosystem services inputs of all of those types so that we can model them as part of life cycle analysis.
That's interesting. Even if you don't put a price on it, you want to know the math of it. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. We want to capture it so ultimately it can be compared to other products and people can make decisions about what products to specify and so forth. And, it at least is data that could ultimately one day be used in that way.
Right. Yep. Makes great sense. Questions, comments? Anybody else? Jump right in.
I have a question for Ellen.
Okay.
On farming, rather.
Okay.
Has the University of Maine agricultural scientists been able to quantify the amount of sequestration of carbon that happens in well-running organic vegetable, dairy, and other farms? And if so, is it being applied to some of the larger farms in Aroostook County that might benefit financially from being paid for their ecosystem services?
So part of the analysis they're doing right now is sort of looking at the carbon sequestration potential, and they're looking at it across different agricultural sectors and different size farms. So they're using modeling that would help to look at sort of what it might mean in terms of potato farming in Aroostook County to sort of organic diversified veggie production. But we don't have that analysis yet. We'll hopefully get the preliminary analysis in the beginning of April, and then the full research will be done towards the end of the year. And I think that'll really help to inform what sort of are the priority practices. But the thing that I always say about natural climate solutions is that these are practices that all different types of farmers could be adopting. We organized in conjunction with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension and the Southern and Central Aroostook Soil and Water Conservation Districts, an event at Presque Isle about sort of different healthy soils practices. And it was really great. And there were a lot of larger potato farmers there. And who were asking a lot of questions. And we had a keynote speaker who was a non-organic potato farmer in Colorado, who is using a lot of these practices with a really high degree of success. And there was an incredible dialogue between the potato farmers in Maine and him. And so I think there's a lot of interest in this, if not for the sort of climate benefits, because so many of these practices do have farmer profitability benefits and reductions in production costs. And from our perspective, however you want to, we're going to meet people where they're at. And so, whatever gets them interested in these types of practices, that's great. And we just want to help them think through what practices make the most sense for them and their operations and their cost profile.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's some very basic baseline data that needs to be collected by those farmers in the different areas of food production that as to what's happening on their own land. And I bet there's some folks besides, you know, I was willing to do this on the small farm in Monmouth, but it's going to be more relevant. Is anybody doing that research? Are you just starting that now to collect how much does my acre of, you know, organically managed vegetables versus actually sequester? So we could start having a justification for pricing it.
Ellen, before you answer that, let me just jump in and say it's 1:02. Anybody that needs to go, please, you can sign off. That's fine. We're going to keep talking for a few minutes if people are willing. And just know that I'm going to post the slide deck and if the recording worked, I'll post the recording on the Maine Climate Table website so you can have access to this information or share it with anybody else. So go if you need to go. We're going to keep talking for a few minutes, and Ellen, I'll turn it back to you for that question.
Well, yeah, so they will be, through their modeling, they will be able to sort of make estimates about carbon sequestration potential. But I also wanted, because I think Leah from Wolf's Neck was on the line, and they have a really exciting project. I don't know if you're familiar with Open Team.
Yeah.
But I think that's going to be really helpful too in terms of on-farm sort of diagnostics of the level of soil health and the potential there.
Hey, Ellen, Nancy, this is Glenn again. To answer Nancy's question, one thing in terms of existing data, that 10-year potato systems project, they did some great work, and they were, you know, it's really intensive use of compost and building or soil organic matter, and they showed they could boost the organic matter content of the soils, increase it by about 2.5%, which is substantial. You can do the math on that and get
it's huge, yeah,
tons per acre. And then another thing that's going on much less formally is Sue Eric and Sonia Berthasell. They went through all this Maine soil lab records for the last, I don't know, 40 years or something, and looked at this is an informal, non-published research thing, but they looked at the soil carbon measurements in those soil samples, and basically the trend was flat. It was a little bit towards the positive for non-potato soils and a little bit negative. It wasn't statistically significant either way. So basically it's flat on the soil organic matter content of those soil test results. So.
This is Cy. I'd like to go back to the question of ecosystem services, because it's a societal issue. It becomes a political issue, and the way we have dealt with it in the U.S. is two ways. Largely through regulation. Clean water is a perfect example. I'm not picking on it, but it's an easy example. And wildlife habitat. But the way we've dealt with it largely is through current use taxation. It's through taxation. The current use programs don't say they're paying for anything specifically except for continuation of the use. That's one way. Another way is to look at taxes charged, basically the income tax charged on the value of products. If you look around the world, it's very interesting to see how there are places where they want timberland so much that the land taxes are almost zero and the income from the products from that land are essentially zero in order to keep those lands productive. So taxing seems to be the way our society deals with this, rather than paying directly for individual ecosystem services. The carbon market is an outlier, and it's fascinating to see it develop, and it may develop in parallel, but that's where we are at the moment.
So I thank you. That's really, I should have thought about it that way, but hadn't. I mean, the tax system is essentially a social, everybody pays because everybody benefits for these services. So it makes logical sense that the tax system would give a break for these kinds of things. Good point. Anybody else?
I have a question. This is Parker Gassett from the University of Maine. And you've spoken mostly to opportunities for carbon sequestration. I suppose this is a question for Ellen. Could you speak about incentives for land use practices that are possibly focused more on infiltration and stormwater protections, or nutrient pollution that's a growing problem for estuaries, possibly living shorelines along the coast, some other land use aspects that are kind of mitigating direct impacts rather than just total CO2?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say that a lot of the practices, both as part of the research that's going on, but just generally too, have many benefits beyond mitigation benefits. And so some of the same practices that farmers would use to achieve some level of carbon sequestration also have significant water quality benefits. In fact, states across some of the states, particularly the states in the Midwest and also around the Chesapeake Bay, are using some of their water quality initiative funding to help support farmers in using some of these practices because they have those sort of water quality benefits. Because when you build the health of the soil, right, it sort of starts to act more like a sponge and you prevent soil erosion and runoff. So there are a variety of different benefits that are achieved, but oftentimes these practices can sort of achieve many different benefits in addition to farmer profitability benefits as well.
And so what is the overlap between your land use planning working group with the Climate Council and the Marine and Coastal Working Group? Are you confronting these issues together?
Yeah, so that has been sort of one of the things that I think the Maine Climate Council organizers have really been trying to think through is how different working groups communicate with each other. So there was a full Climate Council and all the working groups were invited to some presentations by different members of the Science and Technical Committee at the end of January. And then there were opportunities where the chairs of different working groups sort of provided some information about what their working group was doing, and different members could go to different working group sessions and sort of interact with the chairs and ask questions. And certainly there are lots of issues that overlap. For instance, you know, one of the things we're seeing in the agricultural context is that, you know, while Maine Farmland Trust is very supportive of solar energy development, we are seeing that with the passage of the solar legislation last year, there's just been, you know, just an influx of solar developers, a lot of whom are trying to develop agricultural land. And so we've been sort of working with them and others to achieve the right balance between solar development and agricultural production. So anyway, so that's something that we've been kind of trying to reach out to the energy group about. And I think that the organizers of the Climate Council will be looking for opportunities for some of that cross-working group dialogue. I don't know with, you know, the coronavirus, how that will be impacted, but I certainly hope that will continue, because I think there are a lot of issues that cross, you know, the sort of directives of the individual working groups.
Yeah, and it's kind of odd, even though I'm in DeForest, I'm actually on the coastal and marine group. Ellen's on the working lands group. And there is a lot of we see a lot of commonality among the groups. Like we all need a monitoring system for climate impacts. And that's a subject that is crossing all of the different working groups right now. And the chairs of the co-chairs of the working groups interact with each other. So we have a lot of hope that these issues will be talked about in common. Okay, anybody last thoughts? It's 1:10.
John, I had one more question.
Okay.
Speaking to Glenn's comment about policy mechanisms and how ecosystem services have largely been promoted through taxation methods, if there are positive incentives developed for some of these green spaces and environmentally based adaptation measures, do you expect that there'll be sector specific, one for the timber industry, one for the seaweed aquaculture industry, another for urban forestry, or do you expect that there's going to be more of a pervasive incentive structure that encompasses all of those best practices?
That's a good question. Anybody want to try to answer that? Have a thought?
Well, I've been keeping my mouth shut about this, but that's such a perfect segue for this. So
Who's this?
this is Glenn Kaler again. Sorry.
Okay, Glenn.
So Citizens Climate Lobby has, if you're not aware of it, they've got a carbon fee and dividend proposal, which works on the other side of the equation, where things that create greenhouse gas emissions are charged accordingly, and the money's handled and given back to people on a per capita basis. I won't get into the details, but hearing all this discussion about ecosystem services has me wondering if that same approach could be applied on the other side of the equation, where products that are sequestering carbon, instead of being, because the reverse applies, they would be given a credit. The whole carbon fee and dividend thing, it puts an economic incentive to get away from fossil fuels, because you are charging for those externalities. And if those are negative externalities, right? You know, greenhouse gas emissions. I'm just wondering if that approach could be expanded to externalities that are beneficial. So, you know, a wood product that's sequestering carbon would be, instead of being taxed or feed, would be given a credit in that regard, and that even gives you more incentive to go that direction. That all works at the national scale. It's not really a Maine thing, but state policies can support that at the national scale and work towards that.
Mm. Good point. So if you were a landowner, forest landowner, and maybe over a decade or two moved your land base from more pulpwood to dimensional lumber, you would somehow be given a credit for that.
Well, the way it would work is when you cut that wood for lumber, if you cut it for, you know, biomass, you're not going to get any credit because you're putting it back in the atmosphere. But if you turn it into a product that's going to hold that carbon, then yeah, you get a credit.
Yeah, so the credit would come at the production of the product. At sort of the end of life. Yeah, yeah.
It's like a reverse tax.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, good idea. Okay, any other thoughts? All right, we're down to the hardcore 10 or 15 of us. So, all right, well, I'll wrap it up so everybody can get on their way. If you want to revisit the slide deck, go to our website or watch this old webinar again. It'll be there, and we'll keep you posted on what the next webinar will be about. So thank you all for taking a break from the bad news of the day, and we've enjoyed it. So take care, everybody. Stay well.